The email with the employment offer merely had the subject line, "Conductor Position Private Contract," no logo of the organization, and no sender information other than a string of digits. Scam emails were nothing new to me. I had been unemployed for months and was barely squeaking by. However, the specifics gave me pause when I opened it. The salary was 6 times more than what I had ever earned for a single ride working freight trains, and it was absolutely phenomenal. While the specific hours were not specified, the message placed a focus on being discreet, dependable, and capable of working independently. The very bottom bore a numerical identifier, partly anticipating a disconnected line and partly expecting a notice about robotic scams I dialed. Rather, a male operator picked up on the very first ring. He inquired as to my availability for a meeting the following day, and merely identified himself as a recruiter working for an undisclosed client. Just a location, no name of the company or address of the office, a highway diner by the side of the road. Naturally, I arrived at the diner just as it was starting to fill up. Sitting in a booth towards the rear, the man was patiently waiting for me to arrive. Aside from his expressionless face, he sported a sharp black suit and tie. He merely motioned for me to take a seat without even introducing himself. This was no idle chatter. Across the table, he slipped a contract. He remarked in a low voice that you will get instructions in the form of a list. Take a look at these while you work. They can't be changed. Well, okay. What are the specific directions we wait? I gave it another go. I glanced up at the hiring manager. So what exactly is this train? His countenance remained unchanged. All you have to do is do as told. The rest should go without saying. After that, he indicated a spot in the contract center. Just one line, bolded. As soon as you disobey any directive, hit the red button located in the central console. You will be instructed by someone. It was nearly funny. What happens if that doesn't happen? The recruiter merely looked without moving or speaking. He tapped the contract once more after a considerable pause. Please sign. I was utterly surprised by the private station. Behind an industrial lot on a dead-end road, hidden by rusting gates and partially destroyed buildings, it stood. In the gloom I could make out nothing but a pair of weathered but spotless tracks and a shiny, spotless train. No one seemed to be there. It seemed like the train was part of a collection owned by a billionaire. Slim and lengthy, it shimmered in the faint light of the platform. The outside was immaculate, with no visible dings or scratches. I went through the conductor's door and into the control room. There was a new, polished aroma in the cabin. Modern and yet alien, every knob, switch and lever was in its exact spot. It was impossible to tell that this train had ever been in use because there was zero dust, there was no seatbelt, and the chair was rather rigid. On top of that, there were hardly any people in the passenger cars. There is no boarding personnel and only a little amount of luggage. There were no customers in sight. I was completely oblivious to my destination, the train's owner, and the nature of the cargo I was carrying. I took a seat in the chair and reached over to remove a laminated sheet from the control panel. Here are the details. No matter what, the train must continue its relentless march. There shouldn't be anybody on board, so don't open any passenger doors. You should not respond to a knock on the door if the vehicle is empty. Keep going at full speed and avoid looking behind at anyone who may be on the tracks. All cabin lights must be turned off for 3 minutes at precisely 2:30 a.m., then proceed as directed. Say, "We are on schedule," when asked to react to a silent intercom, and then wait precisely 5 minutes before speaking again. Refrain from looking at or acknowledging the people already seated in one of the train cars. Upon returning from a break, if you observe someone seated on the conductor's seat, it is imperative that you exit the train without delay. Reboarding will be impossible. Do not stare at another train for more than 10 seconds. If it runs parallel to yours, someone will call you with extra instructions if you push the red button immediately after breaking an instruction. They were read aloud to me twice. I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of twisted joke is this? I peered about the cabin, anticipating the presence of concealed cameras and a speaker system that was about to unleash a voice mocking my reaction. Upon entering the control cabin, however, all I could see were the elaborate and lovely decorations that adorned the walls and corners. Smirking, I made a sneering gesture. I had heard that some organizations put prospective personnel through tests to determine their tolerance for trash, but I couldn't confirm it. Possibly an extreme measure meant to instill fear in the conductors and keep them fully engaged in their work. But God forbid they felt the need to, a train that is. To keep things going, you must adhere to the schedule and keep an eye on the rails. Why did people start pounding on doors and not even bother to glance at the passengers? On my temples I washed. Oh well, I would comply if they asked me to. As long as the payment went through, they could impose whatever strange regulations they pleased. As it glided silently along the tracks, the train blasted out of the station. I couldn't even know I was moving when I closed my eyes because the engine was so smooth and silent compared to anything I had ever operated before. I hardly used any of the controls. Pretty much nothing noteworthy occurred in the first hour. The moonlight reveals nothing but vast expanses of uninhabited farmland and thick trees. Traveling on rails was relaxing. I was under the impression for a second that this would be the simplest job I'd ever had. It was then when the intercom began to crackle. The cabin was suddenly and sharply filled with static. I twisted around in my seat, as if anticipating a word or direction. Cursing under my breath, I tapped the panel and flipped a few switches to silence the channel. Still zero result. As I sat down, my gaze strayed to the accompanying set of regulations. 6th place. When the intercom goes off and no one answers, you should reply with, "We are on schedule," and then wait precisely 5 minutes before speaking again. I wavered for a moment. Did you think it was foolish? A silly company policy put in place to gauge my compliance? I knew for a fact. My throat was cleaned. Oh, we're right on time. There was a change, but I couldn't place it right away. My skin felt a sudden rubbing sensation, as if I were submerged in water and everything else floated above me. The distant buzz of the engine seemed to be getting closer. I forced myself to look ahead, fixating on the tracks. I have 4 minutes. As I persisted in sitting, the situation deteriorated. I couldn't maintain eye concentration as my head began to ring. All it takes is 3 minutes. My arm hairs stood on end. Now the air had a charged, unusual smell, as just before a thunderstorm. Only 2 minutes, I was completely tied down. Give it a moment. The emotion faded. Suddenly the burden was removed. The engine's usual sound returned. The time was verified. Precisely 5 minutes. Calmly, I let out a breath. My God, what on earth was that conspiracy theory documentaries I'd been viewing? Had me thinking about brainwashing people into certain radio waves and all that, but I pushed the thought out of my head and continued on. Quickly, the train moved forward. I could see the night sky in the distance. As I was beginning to calm down and ignore the unusual sensation, a flurry of activity flashed past me. Because the figure was moving so quickly out of the trees and onto the tracks, I had to focus in order to make out its features. As the beams of light sliced across the rails, a knot formed in my gut. On the tracks, someone was standing. A guy. He wore loose clothing that fluttered in the wind. Despite the clear night, I was rapidly drawing near him, even though his outline was hazy. Silent, he remained, inching closer to the brakes. My fingers quivered. That was enough. It was a memory of mine. Count 4. Please do not slow down if you see someone on the rails. Stay away from the rearview mirror and those people. I stubbornly refused to listen to the signals from my body telling me to slow down. I don't see why I thought it would be acceptable to hit a man with a train in accordance with any rule or regulation, but I wasn't going to waste time worrying about it. Without making a sound, the train smashed right past him. Worried, I glanced around. It was unbelievable what I had done. As my heart raced, I quickly glanced over at the rearview camera, but then I restrained myself. I was unable to look. I clenched my fists around the levers and refocused my gaze on the controls. As it sped into the night, the train shook ever so slightly. I released the levers, my heart rate increasing. Everything was all right. It was only a light illusion, a random idea becoming entangled in the darkness. The consequences would have been disastrous had I really collided with anything. On my way, I reached speeds of 95 miles per hour. At that speed, even a leaf would be hit by a train of this magnitude. As I exhale slowly, I attempt to relax by thinking about the reward that awaits me at the end. My years of experience in this field were slipping my mind due to these regulations. I expected this to be the same. I suppose the rules were effective because I was anxious and overanalyzed everything. I began to question things. Miles of pitch-black, desolate terrain stretched out before the train, leaving little room for activity. Without realizing it, my thoughts wandered to the passenger screens after briefly glancing over the many knobs and switches. There was now a person occupying one of the vacant seats. Very much the same draping dresses, the same hazy, ill-defined visage. Yes, the identical guy I'd beheld on the railroad. Hard! I blinked. Excuse me? The train was thoroughly inspected by me before to our departure. No one was in any of the cars. I would have known who he was. I could not have possibly missed someone. Was he still here after all this time? A reasonable justification was required. Perhaps I had been merely going through the motions of the startup routine and hadn't paid enough attention to the empty automobiles. This wouldn't be unprecedented. Perhaps I had simply lost track of time. It's something long-distance conductors do frequently. Once you settle into a pattern, it's easy to let your thoughts wander and everything blend together. That was all, I guess. It was irrelevant. The wealthy tycoon I was taking him would have liked to have the entire train to himself. Perhaps you purposefully evaded my gaze. I relaxed after shaking off the stress in my palms. The train was in motion. All systems were operational and I had a passenger. At this point, I was aware of the object I was carrying. If I stuck to the plan, I should be okay. Grassy woodlands stretched on into the night as the world outside whizzed by in splotchy patterns of emerald and silver. A constant even hum resounded throughout the cottage, like a rhythmic heartbeat under my fingertips. Endless miles of nothingness stretching out before and behind. Suddenly, one of the cabin doors started to pound with a slow, steady rhythm. With my gaze darting to the console, I straightened up in my chair. The man was the only occupant in the otherwise deserted passenger cars. It was the same old story. The pounding, however, continued. Here are the regulations again. The third rule is to disregard any knocking noises coming from an empty vehicle. I tried to ignore it and keep moving forward as if nothing was occurring. The pounding, however, intensified. Wow, 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 a desperate attempt to break through as if someone were pounding their fists on the metal. An intense sense of annoyance welled up in my chest. Tired and frustrated, I had had enough of complying with these ridiculous regulations. Because of them, I was so naive that I thought I was going to strike someone. My heart was racing as I got to my feet and marched briskly back into the passenger cabins, my boots stomping on the floor the whole way. I was directed to car 6 by the pounding. I was hesitant. Ignore that. That's what the regulation says. As my palm lingered over the lock, I took a deep breath. Where did I get the idea? For fun. An issue with the door. I was well prepared to face the repercussions, if it was any of those. Because of these regulations, I was having trouble focusing and was seeing things that weren't actually there. If I wanted to show myself right and go on with my shift, I would simply break this one rule. I pried open the door by releasing the lock. There was not a soul in sight in the cabin, other than the footprints. There were no signs of life, including people, baggage, or anything else. They formed an ideal path across the floor, beginning directly in front of me and vanishing into the next vehicle, as if someone had stepped inside just now. The footsteps were grimy and muddy. I felt an icy chill run up my spine as an underlying gut reaction warned me that I had just blown it. I was taken aback before that idea could come to fruition. The locomotive began to reduce its speed. I clutched the doorframe for support as the air shook all around me. Without touching anything, the train started losing speed. With my breath becoming increasingly rapid, I whirled around and hurried back to the control cabin. Suddenly, I looked over at the dashboard. All systems were still operational. Although it ought to have remained steady, the train was gradually decreasing its speed. Once more the radio crackled, a sudden surge of static, Then a distorted voice that seemed to be dragging itself through the speakers. "For what reason did you decide to pause?" My heart pounded violently against my ribcage. Not me. Unengaged were the brakes. None of the safety features were activated by itself. The train had come to a halt. I reached for the controls and pulled the throttle, attempting to get it going again. It was unresponsive. The scenery outside the front window moved at a snail's pace until the train came to a full stop. No sound, promptly following it, disruption. At the periphery of the faint platform lights beyond the trees, figures were stepping out of the shadows. Countless ones, their slender, towering bodies extended at an odd angle as they steadied themselves and made their way to the train, strolling leisurely. A mechanical screech pierced through the air with a sickening ache in my gut. I quickly turned my attention to the screens. A train was pulling up. I hadn't even touched the controls once more. My knuckles were white from continuing to grip the throttle tightly. There was no indication of a stop from the system. We were meant to keep going. Still, it was easy to unlock the doors. The people outside advanced. Their silhouettes shifted in the faint light from the train's headlights as they stepped out of the woods, one by one. They seemed to be moving at a leisurely pace. One by one, they filled up the empty automobiles as they climbed inside. On the screens, I could make out their figures filling every available inch of the room, yet remaining still. Whispering a curse word, I frantically scanned the dashboard for an override emergency restart or failsafe as my fingers raced over its many buttons. The experiment was a failure. I manipulated the throttle forward, turned the breaker on and off, and tried the radio. No outcomes. The doors were left open as the figures began to board from the outside. Every single one of the figures just stood there staring ahead. Anxiety welled up in my heart. Severe dread. I felt my heart racing in my ears. My train is stuck. What's the matter? I hurriedly looked for the red button. I forcefully pressed my hand down on it. In a flash, the radio was up and running. "Hello," I sounded terrified, and my voice was harsh. The train came to a complete halt without my intervention. "You disobeyed an order." Even though I felt a knot in my throat, the voice kept going, "Pay them no mind. At this point, they are known as passengers. Stay on the road until you reach the final stop and don't breach the rules again. Keep your wits about you." Throughout the lodge, a faint clunk resounded. Closed the door, slid. It was just like the first time when I attempted to move the train. It began to advance without a hitch. My eyes remained fixed ahead as I pursed my lips. The train hurried back into the darkness as the intercom remained silent. My body was always tense, stiff and painful. My fingers stayed clenched around the controls while my forearms ached from the pressure. There was not a single glance that I would return. There was an inescapable feeling that I was in for a rough ride, if I ever recognized their existence again. Something moved at the periphery of my field of vision, moving in perfect step with the train after a period of complete stillness, monotony, and paranoia. On my part, a new flash, a glimmer of light along the same track as mine was another train. Seeing it was illogical. Nothing had indicated the existence of a second set of rails adjacent to my own, and there had been no crossings either. But that wasn't all. Effortlessly maintaining speed, its metallic form shimmering in the soft moonlight, I could make out figures through the windows. The insides seemed to be enveloped in darkness. However, upon closer inspection, I noticed that there were at least dozens of them, if not more, all tightly packed against the window, and they were all sporting identical broad smiles. Their expressions were expressionless as they stared intently into my eyes. They bore an uncanny resemblance to the folks who had just boarded my own train. Position 9. Look away from another train for no more than 10 seconds. If you happen to spot one going parallel to yours, that was a mistake I would never make again. Even though I was vaguely aware of the other train's existence, I paid it no further mind. So I continued on my way. An alarm went off on the intercom. My shoulders jumped and my muscles tensed up in response to the abrupt surge of static. For an instant, all I could hear was silence. The same frigid stillness that had engulfed the radio the previous time I'd hit the red button. 10th place. Glance at the clock. Looking down at the digital clock on the panel, I slowly glanced over it. 2:12 in the morning. 5th position. All cabin lights must be turned off for a duration of 3 minutes at precisely 2:13 a.m. Then follow the on-screen instructions. I stopped and went to grab the toggle. As I turned it upside down, my fingers quivered a little. Complete darkness descended upon the cabin. There was nothing to adjust to, so I blinked in an attempt to do so. Everything seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. There are 0 reflections, 0 outlines, and 0 control. Light glimmers, an empty space. The intercom was picked up once more. There was no setup for this one. A simple, concise statement: remain still. A distinct noise suddenly sprung up. Its sound preceded its sensation, a painful, gradual stomping against the metal subfloor. No, it's not footfall, it's something pulling itself ahead, discs exploding. There was a peculiar snake-like scrape under the train's clatter. For what reason was that sound being made? It accompanied me to the cabin. The wheezing followed. It sounded deep and irregular, as if whatever it was inhaled through staggered bursts from multiple lungs. The cabin was filled with a dense, sticky heat that felt like mucus as each breath yanked at the air. A split second after that the odor arrived. I had never encountered anything like it. Smelling like a combination of burnt plastic and harsh chemicals, the aroma was strong and almost medicinal with a sticky, sour undertone. I remained completely still, despite the fact that the smell made me sick to my stomach. It shifted closer to the control panel, sniffed, then crept closer still as it rubbed its breath against the levers. My whole body tensed up at the sound of even a single clawed scratch against the console. Something was brushing against my shoulder, but it wasn't quite touching as it circled me, the warmth of its breath moving from side to side. Even though my heart was about to explode, I was too afraid to breathe. All it takes is 3 minutes. In an effort to control my racing heart, I mentally counted to 10. I was paralyzed and unable to respond. I had no choice except to remain still, as whatever was within the cabin determined my value. Suddenly it vanished without a trace. As the air temperature rose, the odor diminished, a soft tinkle. With a flicker, the cabin lights came on again. I still couldn't bring myself to move, afraid to take any chances. I felt comfortable enough to straighten up in my chair after a time. I pushed down the residual queasy feeling and clutched my lap to steady my trembling hands. The digital alarm went off 2:16 in the morning. On the main screen, I could make out the words, "Come on, it's almost time." Emerging from the darkness ahead, the station lights were chilly and unwelcoming, yet to me, they were the most inviting thing imaginable. There was no braking of the train as it drew near. The brake wouldn't budge, no matter how gently I pulled it. A closer approach was possible. Pulling the lever made my arms feel like they were going to fall off. As my hand ached from repeatedly pressing the red button, I futilely attempted to manipulate the controls, but to no avail. We hurriedly made our way to the platform. My options were limited. My legs began to tremble, and my adrenaline was pumping. Before I could react, it hit. I leaped forward and slammed my chest against the console. As the first shock hit, my stomach then began to crunch. I felt like I was going to die from the excruciating pain. The cabin was ripped apart by the thunderous crack of metal. When the windshield cracked, due to the impact of concrete and steel, I could hardly stand the noise. As the train slammed into itself, it let forth a piercing scream-like sound. The front cars squished together like a Coke can, the impact bending the walls inward, and sparks flew across my field of vision. The entire universe swiveled around. I skidded backwards, collided with the wall, and then rolled onto the floor. Both my ears and ribs were in pain. Smoke and dust floated through the air, clogging my lungs with each labored breath. I could make out the last moan of the train, its shaking lurch as it slammed to an abrupt stop somewhere beyond the din in my head. As I lay there, my hands quivered on the icy floor, utterly taken aback. I had not yet died. Despite the collision and the absolute devastation I had just witnessed, I managed to stay alive. I pulled myself up slowly and painfully. The lodge was in one piece. Nothing broken, nothing twisted, nothing crumbling. As if it had never budged, the train sat motionless at the station. The windshield was unshattered, the console was undamaged, and the engine's quiet hum had returned steady, as if it had been in operation the entire time. The pain of the bruising on my arms was familiar, though that accident had me in it. Just a few moments earlier, I was certain that my injuries were deadly. However, the train had crashed into the station and crumbled all around me. I knew it for sure. But here I remained unscathed. I glanced over at the passenger screens and noticed that several of the seats were vacant. Those inconceivable passengers were finally removed from the train. Upon first glance at him, my gut knotted up. The man was still there, albeit the others had vanished. As he strode, his garments fluttered. He got up from his seat and started to stroll forward with a fluid grace. His motions were mesmerizing in their fluidity. A knot formed in my stomach as my gut told me to bolt, to run, to escape before something irreversible happened. Even as I stumbled over to the door, it was locked. It would not budge, no matter how hard I tried to open it. It was the first time since this nightmare started that I had a moment of clarity, and I recognized how wrong everything had gone. The weight of the moment was stifling. I jolted out of my reverie and pounded the red button. There was no sound from the radio. As my palms perspired against the plastic, I struck it once more with more force. This time received no reaction. The guy continued to stroll with a surge of desperation that felt like vomit. I pushed the button harder this time. Behind me, the doors swung open. With excruciatingly slow motion, the last remaining door slid open, revealing an empty, dark chasm beyond. The cabin was suddenly filled with a deep, mechanical roar. Entering the conductor's cabin, he took his place. That was it. I froze my back against the console, and every muscle in my body tensed up as he came to a sudden halt within feet of me. From a closer view, his asymmetrical body, excessively long arms, and slightly stiff posture were even more noticeable. The concept of a man seemed to have been constructed without ever having laid eyes on one. It was a near-perfect representation that was missing some essential detail. His head cocked ever so slightly as if to pay me direct attention, and it was the first time that had happened. A still small voice within that lacked any discernible age, tone, or harshness. His voice carried. The ride was appreciated. He continued to stare at me for an extra second, his expressionless face showing no signs of emotion. Afterwards, he turned around and silently exited through the conductor's room door, the one that I had been unable to open. Despite my best efforts, I was distracted by a new noise, traces of walking. I shifted my gaze to the stage. Recruiter stood by. Standing before him, he had his hands properly clasped. With a bound, I leapt from my seat and charged headfirst toward the man. Just who, my God, what on earth was that? For the life of me, what was I carrying? Tell me what transpired. It took a while for the recruiter to respond. Rather than looking at me, he continued to stare at the train, his eyes fixed on the vacant cars. Before he eventually spoke, he made a barely audible sound. In your opinion, how was the position tomorrow night is going to be another ride? You were an absolute star in getting the train to its final destination. I decided to leave. My voice was rough as I rasped. The money is irrelevant to me. Whatever this is, I could care less. That is all. A friendly, welcome smile graced the recruiter's face rather than an arrogant one. After that, he slowly nodded at me. It was as if you were carrying souls. No further inquiries were made by me. No matter how ridiculous what he said seemed, I was too exhausted to give it a second thought or come up with an explanation. Having barely escaped the horror, I alighted from the train and the recruiter. One thing was very clear to me. If given the chance, I would never ride a train again.